Good afternoon, everyone. Happy holidays. Thanks for joining us for the December episode of Kelleher and Holland's monthly Lunch and Learn webinars. I'm Amy Rizzo, the marketing manager here, and we have a 3-for-1 special discussion for you today. Our panelists will touch on the NLRB's joint employer rules, the recent executive order on artificial intelligence and how it affects employers, and the latest developments regarding the Illinois Paid Leave for All Workers Act and the new Chicago Paid Leave Law. So that is a lot to fit into the next 30 minutes, so let's get started. We were set to include a trio of panelists today from our employment law group, Andy Bowling, Madeline Kelleher, and Mike Morrison, but unfortunately, Madeline is unable to participate today. But I wanted everyone to know that she is an instrumental part of our Lunch and Learn team. So, Mike, I have been hearing a lot of buzz about the joint employer rule. What do employers need to know about that?
Well, thank you for that introduction, Amy, and thank you for everyone for taking the time to sign on and hear about this significant development in the joint employer context. I will start with a quick summary of the highlights and follow up with some more detailed comments as we go along. The NLRB has finalized a new rule that provides an independent business entity may be deemed joint employer of another company's employees merely because it has authority or control over any essential term or condition of their employment, regardless of whether it actually ever exercises that control. This new rule expands the current rule's definition of the essential terms and conditions of employment by including additional terms that are inherently vague. The upshot of all this is that it will be far more likely for one business to be deemed a joint employer of another business's employees under the NLRA, the National Labor Relations Act. The impact will be most severe in the context of union organizing efforts, although it could also create potential unanticipated exposures for wage and hour and employee misclassification claims. This new rule takes effect on December 26, 2023, so in about 4 weeks, and rescinds and replaces the more business-friendly joint employer rule issued by the NLRB in 2020. So, what is this new rule? Under the NLRB's current joint employer rule adopted in 2020, an entity may be considered a joint employer if it exercises actual and direct control over a specified and clearly defined list of essential terms and conditions of employment. The new rule, titled Standard for Determining Joint Employer Status under the National Labor Relations Act, eliminates the requirement that control actually be exercised, providing that an entity may be a joint employer if it, quote, possesses the authority to control, whether directly or indirectly or both, or to exercise the power to control one or more of the employee's essential terms and conditions of employment. In the final rule notice, the NLRB explained that an entity has such direct or indirect control, quote, regardless of whether that entity exercises such control. So they're pretty clear about why they're making the change. The new rule also specifically defines what the, quote, essential terms and conditions of employment are, and they are as follows. 1, wages, benefits, and other compensation. 2, hours of work and scheduling. 3, the assignment of duties to be performed. 4, the supervision of the performance of duties. 5, work rules and directions governing the manner, means, and methods of the performance of duties and the grounds for discipline. 6, the tenure of employment, including hiring and discharge. And 7, working conditions related to the safety and health of employees. It's important to note here that these 7 terms represent what the NLRB considers the quote-unquote core subjects of collective bargaining contemplated by the NLRA. Further, the NLRB's rule expands on its proposed rule that was released in September of 2022 by requiring that a joint employer of a group of employees must bargain collectively with the representative of the employees. While a joint employer will be required to bargain only over those terms and conditions that it, quote, possesses the authority to control or exercises the power to control, it must bargain about all terms and conditions over which it has actual or exercises power to control. even those the rule does not define as essential. Um, Despite the comments to the proposed rule from employers in particular sectors and industries that anticipate some substantial negative impacts from this new rule, such as the building and construction industry, franchisors, staffing agencies, and healthcare, the NLRB declined to carve out any exceptions or otherwise make clear how and to what extent the rule applies to particular industries or common business arrangements. So a lot of unknowns. Instead, the NLRB has left businesses to guess and rely upon the NLRB's assertion that it will be, quote, mindful that applying the final rule will require sensitivity to industry-specific norms and practices, end quote, whatever that means. And it is noted that it will take any relevant industry-specific context into considerations when considering whether an entity is a joint employer. A lot of unknowns about how this is going to play out. One thing to note here, this new rule largely mirrors the short-lived and much criticized rule that the board adopted in its 2015 decision in Brown Ferris Industries of California, which had rejected the direct and immediate control framework. The new rule makes clear that joint employer status only exists where an entity has authority or control over essential terms or conditions of employment. And the rule sets forth a list of what specifically is considered essential terms and conditions, which is the list that I just went over, those 7 items. The board majority stated that the new rule, quote, more faithfully grounds the joint employer standards in establishing common law agency principles. However, the new rule actually expands on Browning-Ferris's broad approach, deeming that joint employer status can exist based on any level of authority or control that putative joint employer reserves or has over any essential employment term. So the Brown-Ferris decision at least allowed for consideration of the extent to which the potential control existed and whether it was material to bargaining. So where do we go from here? What are the next steps that the folks in the business community should be mindful of and consider in light of this new law, which is coming shortly? Unfortunately for the business community, we expect that this new rule will spawn uncertainty and increase claims, since it eliminates the clear standards and predictable consequences the current rule provides. And it deprives employers of the ability to reasonably forecast the risks and costs of their contracts with providers, vendors, subcontractors, franchisees, etc. All companies and business entities should now at least consider reviewing their current and pending contracts with third parties to evaluate and assess whether those agreements could be interpreted under this new law as reserving the right to potentially control any essential term or condition of another entity's employees. And given that, as we talked about, actual exercise of direct control over another entity's employees creates a meaningful risk of being deemed a joint employer under most federal labor and employment laws. An employer that allows the employees of a third party to perform work on its premises also may want to consider reviewing the actual practices of their supervisors and managers, and to the extent possible, given the particulars of any business situation, training them to avoid actions that might be used to argue has direct or indirect control over another entity's employees. Obviously, a lot going on there. This is a big change in this field, but hopefully this gives you some things to be on the lookout for and be mindful of as 2024 kicks in. So hope that answers it for you, Amy.
Great. Thank you, Mike. That was very informative. So, Andy, there was a lot of news coverage about a White House order on artificial intelligence. Is there anything in that order that is relevant to employers?
Sadly, Amy, the answer to that question is yes. Buried within a sprawling 111-page executive order that covers a range of topics from cybersecurity, preparing biologic materials, consumer fraud, national security and safety, there are actually several points that employers should keep in mind. Now, let's start with just a brief bit of background. This is not the current administration's first warning statement about the misuse of AI. They have been admonishing employers to avoid using AI in ways that would cut against the administration's current equity-based initiatives. They recognize that AI is increasingly widespread in the workplace. In fact, the current chair of the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission has stated that, in her view, at least 80% of all employers in this country use some form of AI in making employment decisions. Now, the executive order in many ways simply summarizes and underscores the prior guidance from the White House, but this time they put some teeth in by directing federal agencies to come up with plans and procedures to address their concern. A day before they issued the AI executive order, the White House issued a fact sheet. And in this fact sheet, which is a companion to the executive order, they reiterated that a core goal of the AI order is to, quote, to ensure that AI advances equity and civil rights, close quote. Now, let's go to some of the key directives. Again, the directives are marching orders to federal agencies, but we know that what starts with the federal agencies is going to flow downhill quickly into the private sector. First, it orders the Secretary of Labor, in conjunction with outside entities such as labor unions, to develop best practices and principles to mitigate job displacement and other harm that might be caused by introducing AI and that would result in potential job losses. Once these best practices are identified, the agencies are then expected to adopt the guidelines to the extent feasible in their programs. Second, Secretary of Labor, again, is issued an order to provide guidance, ensuring that employees are appropriately compensated for all hours worked under the Fair Labor Standards Act when using AI tools to monitor and augment employees' work. In other words, this kind of goes back to some of the proposed changes to the Fair Labor Standards Act that we discussed in our last luncheon webinar. They also direct the Architectural and Transportation Barriers Compliance Board, raise your hand if you knew that such a board existed, to issue technical assistance and recommendation on the risks and benefits of AI when using biometric data as an input. And this is relevant under the order in the context of disabilities and potential disability discrimination, because they mention specific technologies that are often associated with automated monitoring of employer work. It specifically identifies the potential risk of unequal treatment of people with disabilities, quote, from the use of biometric data like gaze direction, eye tracking, gait analysis, and hand motions, close quote. So they're trying to put maybe some limits from an employee side on the overreach of Big Brother, watching everything that you do in your workplace and even working from home using the company's computer systems. The chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors is required to prepare a report regarding potential impacts of AI on the labor market. And the Secretary of Labor, again, is required to submit a report identifying options for strengthening federal support for workers facing labor disruptions, i.e. job losses caused by AI. And here's another potentially, I think, really big one. The United States Department of Justice is directed to increase coordination with federal civil rights offices, such as the EEOC, on AI and algorithmic discrimination issues, and algorithms, which are the heart and soul of AI and are often used as the filters to reach certain outcomes, say in employment application screening. They want to make sure that the algorithms themselves don't produce disparate outcomes based on gender, race, and other protected characteristics. It also encourages the Federal Trade Commission to consider whether to use its existing authority, including its rule-making authority. As some of you might remember, they recently did in the context of proposed rules on non-competes to ensure fair competition in the AI marketplace and to ensure that consumers and workers are protected from harms that may be enabled by the use of AI. And finally, because we know there aren't enough councils and committees in Washington, it creates a White House AI Council to help coordinate all of this and make sure that the various agencies work together to ensure effective formation and implementation of policies related to AI. Now, when does all of this have to be done? Probably the agencies will be given an arc of up to 365 days to meet them, although they may put some agencies on a tighter leash and a shorter deadline. So what should employers do now? Well, I think right now the impact is employers should watch. To use a weather analogy, if you're an employer based in Florida, this is like a warning that there's an unusual low developing off the coast of Africa, and it may be coming in the form of a hurricane in a few weeks. Now, if we use the analogy of weeks to years, or maybe even months, watch what the agencies do, because sadly, I think most people will be in the private sector will be impacted by the various teachings and decisions made by federal agencies.
Thank you, Andy. I'm going to let you keep on talking, and we're going to switch to our last topic today regarding the paid leave developments that have been happening it's been a few months since our last presentation when we talked about the Illinois Paid Leave Act. So if you could touch on for the audience any recent developments that have come up since then.
Happy to do that, Amy. You know, as complicated as the Illinois Paid Leave Act is proving to be for employers, I have to say that the city of Chicago has added to the chaos by passing just a few weeks ago a brand new paid leave and amended sick leave and safe leave act, which could have wide-ranging implications for employers in Illinois. But before I speak to Chicago's new law, let's start with just a really brief overview of the Illinois paid leave law. The paid leave law is really the first statewide law in Illinois mandating paid leave for employees to use for any reason of their choosing. This new act will take effect on January 1, 2024, and it means that the clock is ticking and all Illinois employers must review their current policies and procedures and take necessary actions that must be done before the end of this year. And the Paid Leave Act requires just about every Illinois employer, regardless of size, to provide each of their employees up to 40 hours of paid leave for every 12-month period at an accrual rate of no less than 1 hour of paid leave for every 40 hours worked. Employees may use this paid leave for any reason of their choosing, meaning the reasons for paid leave can include illness, vacation, care for a family member, or just about any other reason. And while on leave, employees must be paid their normal hourly rate of pay. All employees working in Illinois are protected, with minor exceptions for independent contractors, and make sure they're really independent contractors, and some employees in the transportation sector who are working under a collective bargaining agreement with the union. Now, public school districts are also exempted, but really our focus in these presentations is on the private sector. Now, one of the open questions under the law and that was still open when we gave our last presentation, was whether it protects employees who work outside of Illinois. And we now have, I think, a pretty good answer on this, because in November, the Illinois Department of Labor issued new proposed regulations to implement the Paid Leave Act. Now, these regulations won't be finalized until early 2024, and they're still subject to comment, and there's going to be a public hearing on them. But right now, they are the best information that we have to work with. And here's what they say about your employees who spend most of their time working and based outside of Illinois. An employee is defined as any person who works for an employer whose base of operations, regional office, or headquarters is in Illinois, and that employee's work is primarily performed in Illinois, or who essentially primarily performs work in Illinois and resides in Illinois. Now, what do we mean by whether work is primarily performed in Illinois? In the Department of Labor, we'll look at the following factors: the ratio of work performed in Illinois versus outside of Illinois, whether the work performed in Illinois is isolated or temporary, and whether the work performed outside of Illinois is of the same nature or has the same duties of the work performed in Illinois. So it's all confusing, but I think we can safely conclude, for example, if an Illinois company has a remote worker who spends all of their time, let's say, working in Colorado, and they might come to Chicago for just maybe a few company meetings, they're not protected under this statute, and you don't have to give him, as a matter of law, the same leave that you're giving to new Illinois employees. Now, the proposed regulations still indicate that if employers have existing policies, they can probably keep them so long as your existing policy is at least as generous as the paid leave policy. And the leave can basically be used for any reason. And most employers probably right now, in my experience, have a few too many strings and conditions, as they reasonably should have, for current PTO and vacation. But if your policy is currently structured to provide at least as much and more as the paid leave law, you can probably keep your policy. But remember, under the Affordable Care Act, many of us were promised if you liked your doctor, you can keep your doctor. And that promise didn't always play out after implementation of the law. Now, there are two ways that employees can set up their paid leave. You can use an accrual method, meaning you will earn your paid leave over time, or you can give it all at once, which we call a front-loading method. And front-loading means use it or lose it. If you give someone their 40 hours at the start of your 12-month year and they don't use it, it's gone. However, if you allow an employee to earn it over time on accrual, they get to carry over at least 40 hours. And under these new regulations, it suggests that you cannot cap the accrual of new leave until the employee has 80 hours in the bank. Now, this is inconsistent, some of us think, with the terms of the statute. We're waiting for more guidance from the state. But now I'd like to talk about the Chicago law, because as if the Illinois paid leave law wasn't challenging enough, now we have a brand new Chicago paid leave and paid sick and safe leave ordinance that will become effective December 31, 2023. And this was just rushed in to implementation second week of November. And there's very little regulations and FAQs to kind of provide guidance over some of the gray areas in this law. In brief, this new ordinance will replace the existing paid sick leave ordinance, and it applies to any employer who employs at least one employee with substantive obligations differing according to whether you're a small employer, which means 50 or fewer, a medium employer, 51 to 100, or a big employer, which means 101 and more. Now, this covers all employers with employees in Illinois and Chicago and expands the definition of coverage under the Chicago Sick Leave Act. And there's one potential game changer under this ordinance that means employers who kind of could safely disregard application of the current Chicago Sick Leave Ordinance may have to think twice about whether they are covered under this new ordinance. And here's why. The ordinance covers employees who in any 2-week period perform at least 2 hours of work while physically present within the geographic boundaries of the city. So let's look at it this way. Let's assume you're a business in Kane County and you're only subject, or will be, to the new Illinois paid leave law. If you have a salesperson, let's say, or a technician who spends several hours a week servicing and visiting customers in the Chicago city limits, you are covered potentially by the Chicago paid leave ordinance. So watch that. This is a very broad net. Commuting time doesn't count. At least we know that, or think that. It's only the hours you're actually working in the city of Chicago. A couple of other crucial differences. On their first day of employment, employees will be entitled to earn up to 40 hours of paid sick and safe leave and another 40 hours of general paid leave. And here's a head scratcher, at a rate of 1 hour per every 35 hours worked per 12-month period. Again, this is potentially a day-to-day chaos maker for companies in Illinois who are trying to manage a harmonized payroll. Because remember, the State Paid Leave Act grants leave at a rate of 1 hour per 40 hours a week. And if you've got some employees who are earning leave under the Chicago ordinance, you're going to have to use a 35-hour tracker. But if you've got other employees earning paid leave, let's say in Kane County, and they're not covered by Chicago, you can use the 40-hour method. So there's a lot of uncertainty under the Chicago law. Now, there's also carryover policies. Chicago sick leave is going to carry over. If you're a small employer with less than 50 employees, you don't have to worry about carryover. Medium employees, you're going to have to allow carryover of, I'm talking about payout. There's also a payout of unused sick leave under the Chicago City Ordinance. And there is really a lot of confusion and chaos. And I probably said that too many times, but that's what it's creating for those of us who are in the HR space. If you accrue leave time under the new Chicago law, you're allowed to carry over up to 16 hours of unused general paid leave and 80 hours of sick and safe leave into the following year. And general unused paid leave must be paid out upon separation or when an employee is transferred outside of Chicago, while unused sick and safe leave does not have to be paid out, and this is true under the current law. Small employers are exempt from this payout requirement entirely. Now, there's a lot more that is happening on the state side, and we're going to address, and I can see that there are already a number of questions that are coming in. We don't have time to address them today, but the good news is we're going to have another kind of emergency lunch and learn webinar focused exclusively on Illinois and Chicago paid leave. And that will be scheduled in the next month. Watch out for your KH emails and notices about this upcoming presentation. Mike and I thank you both for your time today. And Amy, turn it back over to you.
Thank you, Andy, for trying to start to untangle that web of complicated laws that are coming out. And as Andy mentioned, we will be taking a bit of a deeper dive into those last couple of topics in the next 2 weeks. And those dates will be published shortly. And you can check your inbox for more information, as well as our social media page. And I want to thank our panelists again today for unwrapping some valuable insights, and thank our attendees for joining us today. If you have additional questions, you can contact any of our speakers. I have their contact information up on the screen for you. And once again, we will have one more webinar for the year, and check your inbox and your social media for the details on how to register for that seminar coming up shortly. So have a great rest of your day.